Our beautiful Catherine. My life was just about perfect, as close to it as it could be without actually being so. I was young, with a promising career ahead of me, the love of my life by my side, the whole world at my fingertips. I was 23 years old, not a care in the world. I had enjoyed all the milestones of my young life, save for one. I was yet to be a father. Your mother and I had tried, and we tried and tried and tried for 2 years. For those 2 years, our attempts had been in earnest, but we were young enough that we figured we didn't need to rush. We both had the realization that something was wrong around the same time, so I took your mother to the doctor. It was then that we learned that your mother was unable to have any children. The revelation was devastating, to say the least. We had lived our life by some kind of loose plan, but this was the first time a specific point of it had been denied to us. Even still, with more credit to your mother than anything, we persevered. We began looking into alternatives, and soon landed on adoption. It's a long process, adoption. Between the agencies, the lawyers, and meeting prospective families from whom we might get a child, we ran ourselves ragged. The stress of it all, I'm sad to admit, put a strain on our marriage. That's when she came. I remember it was a Wednesday, just about 2 in the afternoon. Your mom and I were eating a late lunch when we heard a knock on the door. Standing on our porch was an attractive, fancy-looking woman dressed all in white, with a briefcase in hand, who informed us that she was aware of our predicament. When we asked how she came to know of it, she told us she was a consultant with the adoption agency we had gone through. She introduced herself as Lillian, and asked if we would be open to speaking with her for just a few minutes. In hindsight, I should have slammed the door in her face, but I didn't. I invited her in, and the three of us sat down in our living room. She told us how sorry she was for our difficulty in having children, and lamented the frustration of both being a client of and working for an adoption agency. Then she asked the question that changed our lives forever. What if I told you that you too could indeed have a baby of your very own? Your mother and I were equal parts skeptical and intrigued. Lillian told us that if we were interested, she could make possible our chances of having our very own child. Obviously, this sounded suspicious, but your mother and I agreed that we would have never forgiven ourselves if we hadn't heard her out. She opened her briefcase and retrieved 2 small vials of dark liquid. She told us that if we consumed this liquid, it would enable your mother to become pregnant. She told us that we would have a happy, healthy baby, and that we could have as many as we wanted. She then told us that on our children's 16th birthdays, they would go through a change that normal children don't go through. This change wouldn't hurt them, that it would cause them no pain at all. Lillian told us that she offered this only to hopeful parents whom she felt truly deserved it, to people she felt would give a child a good home. If I didn't stress it enough before, please understand that our inability to have a child had really taken its toll on us. It seems so foolish in retrospect, an utterly ambiguous deal with what was made to sound like a minimal consequence. In truth, she took advantage of our grief, our frustration, our pain. She manipulated our vulnerability and our desire to have a child, and we fell for it. We accepted the deal. The liquid in the vial I drank was all but flavorless. We each drank it, and that was it. There was no feeling. It was as if we had drank a vial of water. Lillian wished us well and went on her way. We've only seen her one other time since then. Soon after that day, we learned that your mother was pregnant. We were ecstatic, to say the least. Just shy of 9 months after that, your mom gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. We named her Jenna. I'm sure this will come as a shock to you, learning that we had a baby before you. We didn't have you until Jenna was 12, so it's not unreasonable that you don't remember her. Over the years, you've mentioned certain memories, and I'm sorry to say that I've done all I could to erase any trace of Jenna from them. I'm sorry for that, Catherine. Anyhow, as Jenna's 16th birthday approached, your mother and I speculated on what would happen. The surreality of the encounter with Lillian so many years earlier took our minds to wild places. We wondered if she was going to grow wings, if she was going to turn into a giant, all sorts of outrageous scenarios. On the morning of her birthday, your mother and I walked upstairs with breakfast for Jenna to enjoy in bed. When we opened her door, we expected to find her asleep. Instead, we found her standing in the center of her room, simply staring at the door, at us. There was nothing immediately noticeably different about her, but something was off. The tone of her voice, maybe. It was a long time ago, and I've done everything I can to block that day out of my memory, so please excuse any lack of particulars. You, me, and your mother sang happy birthday, and gave her breakfast, and she gave us a half-hearted thank you. That whole morning, though, all she could focus on was you. Her eyes rarely left yours. She would whisper things to you, and you would look at her confused. I only heard one thing she said to you that day. We will meet again. I promise. I think it was at that moment that I knew the girl we had raised. The beautiful, smart, funny, kind, caring girl we had loved for 16 years was gone. Around noon, she took a change of clothes into the bathroom and turned on the shower. Assuming she left out of the window immediately, she was gone for about 3 minutes. What happened next, I remember as clearly as I remember yesterday. She came back in through the front door, and she was covered from head to toe in blood, as if she had swam in a pool of it. She stepped into the living room, where your mother and I were. We were both in shock. She had no expression on her face. She was just indifferent to the entire situation. But her face was different in a way. It was angry, twisted. Her eyes were larger, and instead of the gorgeous blue they had always been, they were a cloudy white with flakes of red. Then in walked Lillian right behind her, dressed all in black. "Say goodbye," Lillian said to Jenna. What Jenna said, it felt like I had been punched in the gut. "Of course, Mother," Jenna said. Jenna walked up to me and gave me a hug, but it wasn't her. It was like she had never hugged anyone before, like she had read about it somewhere and was trying it for herself for the first time. I was too afraid to move, so I just stood there awkwardly as she finished hugging me and did the same to your mother. "Thank you for raising me," she said. There was no emotion in her voice. It was wooden, hollow, completely void of any personal connection we may have once shared. Lillian ushered Jenna out of the house and looked back at us. "You've done well. We will meet again." And with that, she left. Once I snapped out of my paralyzing fear and confusion a few seconds later, I ran out of our front door. But it was too late. They were already gone. We called the police and told them what happened. And we found out what Jenna had done when we thought she was stepping in to take a shower. In our neighborhood, there were only 2 houses that she had gone to. One was a house 2 away from ours. The other was about 3 blocks away. The police say that she attacked at random, just whichever person she saw first. She slaughtered them. They never found the victims' hearts either. What really stumped the police was that the exact same thing happened at 12 other houses spread across town, and they all happened at the same exact time. The victims were butchered, left in the middle of circles made of their own blood. Also with their blood were various symbols drawn on the walls. Investigators initially thought it was some kind of coordinated attack, that there were multiple perpetrators who struck simultaneously. But all the witnesses, and there were a lot of witnesses, said they had only seen one person. A young woman, long brown hair, pretty, between 5'2" and 5'4". When shown a picture of Jenna, they all confirmed beyond a shadow of a doubt that it was she who had attacked their loved ones. When looking into Lillian, investigators found that no such woman had ever been in the employ of or in any way connected to any of the adoption agencies we had interacted with 16 years prior. They never found another trace of Jenna from that day forward. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth. Once we were able to leave town, we moved across the country to this house. That brings me to you, my beautiful Catherine. Your birthday is in 2 days. On that day, something is going to happen to you. Even after everything, I can't begin to speculate as to what that something may be. But nevertheless, it will. I can only assume Lillian will return for you. No matter what happens, your mother and I will always love you. Always. Nothing will ever change that. So please, don't think that what's happening now means any different. I know you weren't expecting to spend the days leading up to your birthday locked in the basement, but I hope the room I built for you provides at least a little bit of comfort. I can only imagine how scary and confusing this must be for you. I hope you understand that we can't let anyone else get hurt. All we wanted was a child of our own, and we love the children we had. We love you deeply, unconditionally. I hope you don't hate us. If I would have had any idea what was going to happen to Jenna, I would have done what I'm doing now back then with her. We just wanted a baby. Catherine, I'm sorry. I would take all of it on myself if I could. I have no doubt that Lillian is going to return. When she does, I will do everything I can to keep her from you. I am sorry to all the people hurt by the decision we made all those years ago, but I will never say I regret it. Your mother and I have cherished every single second we've gotten to spend with you, and we're going to do whatever we can to keep you here with us. I love you, sweetheart. We both do. I'll never forgive myself for you having to go through this, or for Jenna. And it keeps me awake at night, knowing I have 2 more daughters to whom I may very well have to write this same letter in just a few short years. Only they'll remember what happens to you. They both love their big sister very much. Whatever happens on Wednesday, please try. Just try not to hurt anyone. And if you see Jenna, please tell her that we love her and miss her. I'll bring food down for you at 6 p.m. Love always. Your father. To anyone else reading this, I don't know what is going to happen on Wednesday, but I feel as though I owe it to you to tell you to protect yourself. I don't know what Lillian does with the children of the people who drink those vials, but I know that those children can hurt people. I truly hope none of you have to pay the price for our own selfish desperation. My friend Nate was one of those people who was utterly obsessed with horror. Anything from movies to TV shows, documentaries to podcasts. You name it, odds are he knew about it. I used to laugh at the fact that if you tried to talk to him about anything other than horror, you'd be lucky to get 2 words out of the guy. I remember the first time I met Nate. I had just moved to town with my family and was transferring to a new school in the middle of my junior year. Moving to a new school sucks. Doing it in the middle of a school year is even worse. At least, that's how I felt as I stood there after entering the classroom. The entire class stared at me while the teacher shot me looks of annoyance. After she read my slip, she angrily told me to take a seat in the back of the classroom. I sighed and walked quietly past the chittering students. After taking a seat at my desk, I heard a voice to my left. Don't worry, it's not you. She just happened to have a stick surgically implanted in her ass. I found myself chuckling before I even turned. A thin guy wearing dark-rimmed glasses looked back at me. He had black hair combed neatly to the side. He had a very hipstery vibe about him. He held out his hand and introduced himself. Once the lunch bell rang, I found myself standing in the cafeteria looking out at the sea of students. I was desperately trying to find a secluded table to sit at when I heard a familiar voice call my name. I looked over and saw Nate sitting at a table next to a wall. I joined him and we began talking. We chatted about where I grew up and what brought me to this town. He then asked me if I had any hobbies, and to be honest, I really didn't. I told him I played some video games and just liked to watch a lot of movies. When he heard I liked movies, his demeanor shifted slightly, and he then asked me what my favorite horror movie was. I was a bit taken aback by the question, to be honest. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have answered because once I did, boy, the floodgates opened. Nate and I spent the remainder of our lunchtime talking about the movie. I could tell right away he was very passionate about this kind of stuff. More so than I was, but it still beat sitting alone. Days turned into weeks, and I found myself getting more and more into our discussions. I would watch obscure random horror movies the night before, then try to one-up Nate with my knowledge, but he always seemed to know just a little bit more than I did. It was kind of impressive, really. Time continued, and before I knew it, we had both become close friends. Then, about a month ago, Nate brought up a new topic for us to talk about: haunted locations. Now, him and I had spoken about this topic before, usually regarding a movie like Amityville or The Shining. But this time seemed different. He was telling me about a place not too far from where we lived that was actually rumored to be haunted. He went on to tell me that it was a factory built in the mid-1900s, that it was some type of assembly plant. He said that the factory was in operation for around 5 years. Then, one day, all the workers mysteriously vanished. I skeptically asked Nate why anyone didn't notice a bunch of workers disappearing, and he just grinned before telling me that apparently a bunch of federal agents showed up and investigated the building. Then, they boarded up the doors and the state left the building to slowly decay. I nodded at him, turning back to my nutritious school cheeseburger. A few seconds ticked by while I ate, and I could feel Nate's eyes burning a hole in the side of my head. As soon as I looked back at him, I knew what he was about to ask me. He said we should go check the place out. I told him that he was crazy, but he was adamant on going. I should have put my foot down and refused, but after 2.5 weeks of constant nagging, I finally caved. He picked me up from my house at around 9 p.m. on Friday night, and we drove out to the factory. During the drive, Nate and I speculated on what we would find there. After around 30 minutes of driving, the building slowly came into view. Its dark silhouette contrasted against the starry sky behind it. We pulled off the main road and parked on the far edge of the building. Walking up to the factory, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. I wondered why nobody had torn the building down yet. As I was looking up at the building, I thought I saw something moving behind one of the grime-coated windows. Nate called out to me and I answered him, though when I glanced back at the window, it was just dark. Nate was standing next to a large door which only had a couple of pieces of wood fixed to the outside of it. He asked me to help him pry the wood away, and I reluctantly obliged. Once the wood was free, Nate twisted the handle of the door, and with a heavy creak, the door opened. I was beginning to feel nervous at that point. I told Nate that I wasn't staying in there for more than 5 minutes. He gave me a slight nod, handed me a spare flashlight, and we both walked through the door. Inside the factory was exactly what you would expect to find in an abandoned building. The entire interior was mostly gutted and empty. There were a few wooden tables, chairs, and debris scattered about, but for the most part, there wasn't much to look at. We both walked further inside. After a few minutes of fruitless searching, I told Nate that this was a bust and that I was ready to go home. He sighed and agreed, though I could tell he was disappointed. As soon as we turned to leave, we both stopped in our tracks. Standing between us and the open door was the silhouette of a person. At first, I thought it might have been a homeless person and we had wandered into their refuge. I instinctively apologized for intruding and told them that we were just leaving. Though they didn't react. They just stood there, silently. I aimed my flashlight on the person and I'll never forget what I saw. Nothing. It was just a solid black humanoid shape. It took my brain a few seconds to process what I was seeing. It was like the universe cut the outline of a person out in front of my eyes. I looked over towards Nate, who was visibly shaken. I asked him what we should do, and for the first time since I've known him, he didn't say a word. It took a single step towards us, and we both instinctively took a few steps back. When we did, I felt my back brush up against something. I slowly turned with my flashlight. There was another one right behind me. This caused me to lunge away. Then, I heard Nate speak. He whispered, "We're surrounded." Hearing this caused me to shine my light around me. And he was right. There were multiple of these things all standing shoulder to shoulder, like somebody copy and pasted the same silhouette over and over again. They began to slowly encircle us. Their arms began to rise as if they were reaching out for us. I asked Nate once again what we should do, but his silence spoke volumes. I thought we were going to die in that factory, that these things were going to rip us apart. Then, just before they reached us, Nate grabbed my arm and told me to follow him. There was the slightest gap in between two of them and we ran for it. They grabbed at us as we squirmed our way through. Once we were both on the other side of them, we sprinted for the open door. I honestly thought that the door would slam shut in our faces as we approached. But thank God it didn't. We exited the factory into the cool night air. But that didn't stop us. We continued running until we reached Nate's car and drove out of there. Nate dropped me off at my house not long after. Someone who I've known to be an extremely talkative person could only offer up 2 words at that moment. "I'm sorry," he said. A week had passed since that night. Nate and I slowly got back into our normal routine. We hadn't spoken a word about what we saw at the factory the entire week. I was beginning to think that we had both hallucinated the entire night, that our minds made the whole thing up. That was until last night. Nate gave me a call and told me to turn on the news. Curious, I turned on my TV and began watching. There was a reporter standing outside the factory. She said that a fire had been started inside the building, and that most of the structure had crumbled in the inferno. When they asked the local police what caused the fire, they said that they suspected this was arson, caused by a large group of individuals. They said when they arrived, they found numerous fresh footprints in the mud outside the door leading off in various directions, and they are still investigating the matter. I'm not sure what those things were, if they were the missing factory workers from all those years ago, or the reason the workers went missing in the first place. But one thing is certain. Whatever those things are, they are no longer confined to that factory. For some, love can be a fickle thing. In some cases, people fall in love with someone early on in their lives, be it high school or college, and they stay with that person for decades. I truly admire those people. For others, it can take quite a bit longer to finally find that perfect match. Sadly, some people never seem to succeed in that aspect. Though for the most part, by the time people are ready to settle down and have kids and start a family, they have found that special someone. During my last semester in college, I met somebody. I had arrived to one of my classes a bit too early. Although the class seemed empty, the door was unlocked, so I figured I'd let myself in and wait for everyone else to arrive. When I cracked open the door, I noticed that I wasn't actually the first to arrive. There was somebody else already waiting in the far corner of the room. She glanced over at me when I entered, and flashed a forced smile in my direction. I returned the gesture and sat in an empty seat nearby. Time ticked by slowly, and I decided to pass the time by scrolling through my social media on my phone. I glanced over at the girl a few minutes later and saw that she happened to be doing the same thing as me. It wasn't long after that I noticed how much time had passed since her and I had been sitting there. I was beginning to wonder where the other students were, as well as the professor. I navigated my phone to my emails and waited for them to update. There it was, a notification from my professor stating that due to unfortunate circumstances the class will not be held today. She must have not seen the email either, I thought. I stood up and walked over to her. She looked up from her phone. I told her that I had received an email about this class being canceled and asked her if she had received the same thing. A look of surprise washed over her face as she quickly thumbed through her phone. A few seconds later, she confirmed that she too had received the email and stated that she felt like an idiot. I told her that I empathized with that statement and she just returned a defeated laugh. I introduced myself and asked her her name. She told me it was Sarah. I asked her if she didn't have anywhere else to be, if she wanted to grab some lunch with me. There was a trendy sandwich shop a short walk away from the school. She looked me over suspiciously for a few moments, then agreed. We walked, ate lunch, talked about our lives, then returned to school. Sarah and I started dating shortly after that. I'm not entirely sure why, but we clicked instantly. From that moment forward, we had become inseparable. We did everything together. Movies, dinners, get-togethers, you name it. After around 4 months, she asked me to move into her apartment with her. I was hesitant at first. Moving in with someone is a pretty big step in a relationship, and not one to be taken lightly. I found myself constantly wondering if that would be the straw that would break our relationship. Regardless, I wanted to be with her, and I wanted to make this work, so I accepted. I started to move in a few days later, and to be quite honest, I couldn't have been happier. 2 months later, we both graduated college and started working full-time. Ironically, even though I had a degree in computer science, most places that were hiring wanted years of experience, which I didn't possess. I ended up working as a rent-a-cop at a strip mall, while Sarah, who had gotten a degree in business, was hired on at some logistics company. Even though I felt inferior, she never once looked down on me or treated me any less than herself. I was grateful for that. The months started to fly by, and even though my work situation wasn't ideal, I was still very happy with my life. Then, one day, Sarah didn't come home from work for 4 hours after her shift. After the first hour, I tried to call and text her, but I didn't receive a response. 2 hours passed by and I was about to call the police when she finally texted me back. She said a work meeting ran late and that she was now on her way home. I apologized for blowing up her phone and she told me it was fine. The days that followed, Sarah had gotten into the habit of coming home at well past the end of her shift. At first, I wasn't concerned. I just thought she was having a rough week or two at work. Then, one evening after she had gotten home, she jumped into the shower while I was watching TV in bed. She had tossed her phone on the bed next to me and I thought nothing of it. Now, I should mention, I'm not one of those overbearing, snooping boyfriends. I try not to go looking for trouble if I can avoid it. Plus, I honestly had no reason to be suspicious. Then, her phone buzzed and illuminated next to me. She had received a text from a random number. I casually glanced over at her phone and read the message. The text said, "I hope to see you again soon." Reading that was odd. If that was somebody from her work, why would they send that when they see her every day? A few more days had gone by since then, and surprisingly, Sarah had been coming home at a normal time after work. I reassured myself that I was overreacting. Then, a week later, it started up again. She started coming home later and later. During one of those days, I contacted one of her coworkers, a friend who works in the same department. I sent her a message and asked if her and Sarah were in a meeting at work. What she sent back increased my suspicions tenfold. She said, "Everyone left work hours ago. Nobody stayed behind." I thanked her before sulking for a few minutes. I was assuming the worst. Sarah had finally gotten fed up with me and found somebody better. I thought we were both happy, that our lives, albeit imperfect, were still enjoyable, that our relationship wasn't dull. I decided that since I had the following day off work, I'd follow Sarah. I wasn't sure what I would do if I actually caught her in the act with somebody else, but I needed to know. I waited outside her work until her shift ended, and slowly but surely, everyone from her office building began pouring out into their cars. Then I saw Sarah exit. She rushed over to her car, hopped in, and began driving away, in the opposite direction of our apartment. I began following her from a distance, trying to make sure she wouldn't spot me and recognize the car. She had gotten onto the highway for around 20 minutes before exiting into the industrial sector of our city. She finally stopped her car near the back of an old worn-down warehouse of some sort. I parked nearby, wondering if this was the spot of her romantic rendezvous. I got out of the car and tiptoed over to the building. After trying unsuccessfully to peek through one of the dirt-covered windows, I spied a nearby fire escape. I climbed the ladder and found the door at the top to be surprisingly unlocked. I cracked the door slightly and I could instantly hear people speaking inside. I opened it a bit further and stepped onto a catwalk inside the building, before quickly shutting the door behind me. I peered over the railing and what I saw gave me pause. Sarah was standing near a group of people. They were all wearing masks of random animals. Sarah was as well, but I could still recognize her by her clothing. A man wearing the mask of a bear was saying something that sounded akin to a prayer. They all joined hands briefly before two of them broke off and walked to a darkened area of the warehouse. Muffled shouts began to fill the room as I watched the two from before drag a man into the light and throw him to the ground. The group of disguised individuals all lowered their heads upon the man as he begged through his binds. As I leaned farther for a closer look, a loose pipe from the catwalk came free and fell to the ground below. The clattering metal rang out endlessly. In one swift motion, all the masked individuals looked up at me. I quickly turned and ran out of the door. I slid down the fire escape, falling into the dirt below. I scrambled to my feet and ran to my car. I sped out of that area without looking back. During the drive home, a million things were going through my head. Who were those people? Why was Sarah with them? Who was that man and what were they going to do to him? I made it home and packed up as much of my stuff as possible. I decided it would be best to get a hotel room before I tried to figure this stuff out. Once I felt safe in the hotel room, I made an anonymous tip to the police about the warehouse, though I'm not sure if they ever found anything, because Sarah contacted me about an hour or two later, telling me she was home and asking me where I was. I stayed at the hotel for a few days. During that time, I messaged Sarah and told her that my mother had gotten sick and I had to leave to go see her. I didn't receive a reply. I made a trip back to her apartment yesterday. and I found it completely emptied. I asked management if they knew what happened. They said that Sarah had paid off the remainder of her rent, had a bunch of people pack up her stuff, and she left. At this point, I have more questions than answers, and I feel as though Sarah knows that I was there that night. In these past few days, I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm being watched. About 2 months ago, my girlfriend Rachel and I had started noticing odd occurrences happening within our house. We had lived at this house almost a year, and for the most part, we've enjoyed living here. I say for the most part due to a few discrepancies, but those aren't important. The very first odd thing I noticed was when I was awoken in the middle of the night. I heard a scratching sound coming from somewhere in my house. My first thought was that a wild animal had gotten underneath the house or into the attic and was scratching around. I laid there for around 20 minutes, just listening to the scratching. It was faint, but I could tell that it was moving around the house. Then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. I waited for a few more minutes to see if it would start back up again, but it didn't. So I went back to sleep without any more issues. The next strange occurrence happened only a couple days later. Rachel called me into the bathroom and asked me if I had messed with the mirror recently. I told her that I hadn't and asked her why. She had just gotten out of the shower and pointed to the fogged up mirror. 2 large handprints were fogged into the smooth surface. I tried to think if I had touched the mirror at all recently, but I couldn't for the life of me remember. The last occurrence happened not long after that. Rachel and I had just gotten back from the movies when we found all of our doors and windows were completely opened. We checked the entire house, but nothing appeared to have been taken. Another strange detail that I noticed was that none of the entries appeared to have been forced open, though I was positive I had locked up the entire house before we left. These series of events we were encountering were quickly turning from strange to scary, as we were unsure who or what was causing them. Rachel suggested we get some form of security system, and I agreed. Although expensive, the peace of mind would be well worth the price, I thought. I ran out to the store and grabbed one of those home security systems. The system came with various motion sensor cameras which all could be synced to a smartphone or computer. I immediately got to work putting the system in place. I put a camera in a corner of every room in the house, save the bathroom. I synced all the cameras to my smartphone and made it alert me whenever they detected motion within the house. 2 full days had passed since I set up the security, and I was surprised to find that my system hadn't gone off a single time. I found myself sitting there at the tail end of my work shift on the 3rd day, thumbing through my phone, checking the security. Nothing seemed to be amiss. I wasn't sure what to think by this point. Maybe somebody had broken into our house, didn't find anything of great value, and left. Though that didn't explain the handprints on the mirror, or the need to open all the doors and windows, drawing attention to oneself. The days came and went. I was beginning to wonder if I had in fact wasted my money on this security system, as nothing occurred since I installed it. Rachel told me that maybe whoever it was that was doing these things had spied us installing the system and didn't want to risk being caught. I wasn't entirely convinced, but her argument did sound plausible, so I tried not to think about it. Barely a month had passed since our last incident, and we were both becoming more at ease. Rachel's parents invited us up to their house to visit for a weekend. We rarely visit her family as it was, so I thought it would be a nice change of pace. That Friday, we packed up the car and drove the 2.5 hours north to her parents' house. When we arrived, Rachel and her mom spent the entire day gossiping, while her father and I discussed the finer points of grilled meat. While I was standing there chatting, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. Wondering who it was that was texting me, I pulled my phone out and looked at it. It wasn't a text. It was my security system giving me an alert. I felt my pulse quicken as the sound of the grill and Rachel's father's voice faded from my ears. I opened the app and the camera filled my screen. I looked around for any sign of the disturbance, but there wasn't any. The alert clearly said movement detected, though there wasn't anything out of place. I quickly thumbed through the other cameras and all of them were normal. I thought perhaps there was something wrong with the software or even the sensors. I put my phone back in my pocket and disregarded it. That night, after Rachel and I went to bed, I was awoken at 2 a.m. to my phone buzzing lightly on the nightstand. I felt my eyes barely crack open as I pawed around for my phone. My hand finally found it and I pulled the small screen to my face. There was another security alert. With one eye closed and the other opened about as wide as a needle, I selected the app. The camera once again filled the screen. It was the living room. After staring for a few seconds, both my eyes shot open as wide as possible. There was something standing in my house. I could barely breathe as I watched my screen. The camera became grainy and started to flicker the second I began watching it. I couldn't completely make out what it looked like, but it seemed to be wearing dark clothing with a hood covering its head. It was crawling on its hands and feet. Even with the poor video quality, I could see its hands clearly. Its hands were dark and had extremely long fingers protruding out from them. It was like ink spilling out in lines each time it set its hand down. I briefly thought about waking up Rachel and showing her what was happening, but I didn't want to take my eyes off of it. It crawled around on the floor of my living room, down my hall and into the bathroom. I stared at the hallway camera, kicking myself for not putting a camera in the bathroom. I decided now would be a good time to call the police. I got up quietly from bed and tiptoed outside of her parents' house. Once outside, I dialed the police and explained my whole situation. That my home security system had alerted me that someone had entered my house. I told them I keep a spare house key near the front door, and asked them if they could go make sure the house was fine. They told me they would send a patrol car right away. Not 10 minutes later, I watched through the cameras as the police entered my house. They searched the entire house from room to room, but it appeared as though they came up empty-handed. The operator told me that they were unable to locate any signs of forced entry into my house, and I thanked them for taking the time to help. I went back inside and I laid back down. Even though I desperately wanted to go back to sleep, I found myself constantly checking my phone and looking through the cameras. After the third time checking my phone, I set it down on my nightstand. Not 2 seconds later, it buzzed. My hand snatched the phone up instantly and I looked down at the screen. It was back. Only this time it was standing straight up, in the center of my living room. It was a lot taller than I previously thought. It was rigid, with its long arms at its side. It stood motionless for around 10 minutes. Then, it slowly began to lift its head towards the camera. White eyes peered out of the darkened hood. It raised its long arms and pulled the hood down from its head. The skin on its face and head was gray, and even though the quality of the camera was poor, I could see black veins covering its head like roads on a map. It held up a single, long finger to its lips, as if it wanted me to keep it a secret. Then, the screen flickered a second later, and it was gone. I was stunned. My mind was blank. I had absolutely no idea what I just saw. During our drive home, I successfully convinced Rachel that we should move to a house a little closer to her parents, so she could spend more time with them. Our lease was nearing its end anyways. Rachel was a bit suspicious about my sudden suggestion. She questioned whether this had anything to do with these strange occurrences or not. I denied her accusations, reminding her that nothing had occurred since I installed the security system. I didn't want to tell her what I saw. Not simply because I didn't think she'd believe me in the first place, but because I'm worried that if I tell her what I saw, that whatever that thing was, will do much more than scratch the floors and open the windows. The 7th of March 2019 marked one of the greatest leaps for mankind, as the first settlement of human beings set foot on Mars. A project about 20 years in the making finally coming to fruition. And yet, to this day, no one seems to remember it ever happening. 7 people gave their lives to set down on Mars, the first step at colonizing another planet. And as such events usually are, it was broadcasted worldwide. Millions of people had their eyes upon Bright Horizon 9 as it landed on the red planet. My family was no exception, and we excitedly gathered together to watch a part of history in the making.
Wow, this looks just like Arizona,
Jackson said as he took his first steps onto the Mars surface.
Great. Who the hell let Jackson be the one to speak? First words on Mars, real inspirational,
Cameron said sarcastically. The footage was mind-blowing. The fact that we could watch people walk on Mars live 30 million miles away was just another testament to ourselves. The fact that we could do anything. Of course, there was a delay when broadcasting from another planet. It takes approximately 10 minutes for a signal to arrive from Mars, depending on what time of year it is. So live might be an overstatement, but it felt truly magnificent nonetheless. The crew joked around as they took their first walk on the surface, trying to downplay their mixture of nervousness and amazement at the sights. We had all seen pictures from Mars before, but witnessing someone walk around, showing us the environment from their point of view, was something else entirely.
All right, knock it off. Remember, we're not tourists here. So let's try to seem a little professional, at least as long as we're on television, that is.
Gordon said, the assigned leader. Each of them had a camera mounted to their helmet, and since us viewers received all the different feeds, we could freely switch the view on command. I've never seen my dad so excited about anything before. He had just rounded 60 years of age, and even he acted as if a kid again, just watching the moon landing for the first time as he did so many years ago. A couple of weeks passed, and each moment of the astronauts' day was streamed and easily accessible online. According to the view counter, at least 1 million people watched them every day. There were cuts in the signal every now and then, a few hours of dead air, and of course they also slept at the end of each Martian day. I kept watching them for an hour or so after coming home in the evening. It felt so good to live in a time of such scientific advancements, and part of me dreamed that I might set foot on Mars myself one day. Time flew by, and on April 9th, after about a month on Mars, I sat with my dad and watched the stream of another spacewalk. They were collecting samples and checking the foundation for future settlements. Nothing too exciting, but absolutely worth our time. Gordon was usually the one to lead the team, and though he tended to pick Cameron and Jackson, this time he included Anderson as well, a more reserved guy I had hardly even noticed before. The crew had sat down at the edge of the Valles Marineris, a valley roughly 3 times the size of the Grand Canyon, and far deeper. In a way, I had become attached to the crew, watching them almost every day for a month. Jackson was by far my favorite, and judged by his attitude, it was hard to think of him as a professional astronaut, always messing around, joking about the dumbest things. Gordon, on the other hand, fit his leadership role perfectly. Strict, mature, but most of all, he was caring. The rest of the 7 crew members were your run-of-the-mill astronauts, apart from Anderson, who was more of a gentle giant. Each were perfectly chosen for their part of the mission, but somehow not too interesting to watch. Cameron, the crew's only woman, was the smartest of the bunch, and was responsible for most of the station's maintenance. During their expedition, we mostly followed Jackson's feed, only changing over to the other channels while he was busy picking rocks.
Well, this sure is something else.
Jackson said as they looked over the valley.
Yeah, you still think it looks like Arizona, jackass?
Cameron asked playfully. She tended to pick on Jackson, and he often responded with his own snide remarks. As different as they were, they made a great pair. To me, it seemed like a couple of high school kids flirting, but it was oddly endearing to see how normal life could be on a different planet. It was a particularly dark Martian day, and the sun was just about to descend beneath the horizon, meaning the crew had to return to their station. The sunset on Mars differed greatly from the romantic scene we see on Earth. Blue and cold. It was more eerie than beautiful, rising a sense of dread in my body.
I think I prefer the Earth sunsets,
Jackson said.
Yeah, gonna be a while until we see one of those again.
Yeah, if they ever come and pick us up, that is.
Jackson added. Once the sun had set sufficiently low, Gordon ordered everyone to pack up. The crew abated, but seemed upset that their work had been cut short. Before the crew could even begin to collect their things, the audio glitched out completely, and the entire feed was cut from any camera available. Not a big deal. It happened often enough to seem trivial. The feed returned after a couple of minutes as I came back from the kitchen with a cup of coffee. My dad had engulfed himself in the footage, which finally returned. This time we were following Gordon's point of view. We were met with the sound of panting.
Did anyone see that?
Anderson asked. Just the fact that Anderson, a mountain of a man, barely ever opening his mouth to speak, uttered anything with fear in his voice felt terrifying enough.
See what?
Gordon asked.
There was something moving down by the chasm.
Anderson clarified. Before anyone got a chance to investigate, they were interrupted by a panicked Jackson.
Can anybody hear me?
Jackson shouted. We swapped the feed to Jackson's, the camera panning frantically around as he searched for his crew.
Calm down, Jackson. We're here. The comms just shut down for a minute. It's just a glitch.
Gordon responded.
Then why can't I see you?
He asked. At that point, the camera changed to Gordon's view, and despite showing exactly the same environment, Jackson was nowhere in sight.
Did you walk off somewhere, Jackson? What are your last coordinates? No way! I didn't move!
He shouted back.
Get a hold of yourself. We'll find you.
Gordon replied. The view switched back to Jackson for a moment, just in time to see a blurry shape fly by him at an incredible speed. He let out a short, agonizing scream before his feed was cut off, leaving us with nothing but a pitch-black screen.
Jackson, can you hear me?
Gordon asked.
Jackson!
The crew looked around at each other in shock, the view once again being redirected to Gordon's feed.
Where is he?
Cameron asked.
I don't know. According to his GPS, he's just gone. Call back to base, tell him to search the grid. I'll check if he somehow fell off the cliff.
Gordon said as he gestured towards Cameron.
Control, do you read me?
Cameron radioed. No response.
Control, Daniel.
She repeated.
Gordon, they're not responding.
None of the astronauts dared come up with a suggestion, seemingly torn between going back to check on the crew at the station, or to stay and search for Jackson.
We've got to get back to the station.
Anderson finally shouted.
What about Jackson?
Cameron asked.
If something happens to the station, we're all dead anyway.
The crew rushed back to Bright Horizon 9, none of them saying a word in the process. Gordon led the chase, turning around every so often to check that the whole crew was still following him. Upon checking, Anderson had simply vanished behind them as they had run for the station.
Where's Anderson?
Gordon asked.
Well, I don't know. He was right behind me just a second ago.
Cameron stuttered back. All the other feeds had long since gone black, including the cameras back at the station. It didn't take them long to run back to Bright Horizon 9. The doors to the station were left open, but none of the remaining crew were anywhere to be found. Gordon was becoming more frantic by the minute, losing the clear composure he had kept up that far in the mission.
Damn it, what happened to them?
He said.
I don't know. I sealed the door. I'll look for any heat signatures in the area.
Cameron replied. She desperately typed away at the console, scanning over and over.
There isn't anyone... hold on.
Whatever the console read was beyond my understanding of computers and gadgets. I was simply glued to the screen. Not me nor my father uttered a word. A minuscule amount of hope returned to Cameron's voice.
Jackson's tracker just came back online.
She called out joyfully. Gordon was heading for the door again.
I'm going out to find him. You stay here. Don't open the door until I come back.
He said. The words were brave, but he couldn't hide his trembling voice. Cameron tried to refuse his orders.
Promise me.
He said.
I promise.
She reluctantly responded. I clicked back to Gordon's view. The sun had already set on Mars, and nighttime was as dark as anything I had seen on Earth, even with its 2 moons. The camera mounted on Gordon's helmet hardly captured any light, even with the flashlight he carried.
Keep talking to me, Cameron.
Gordon asked nervously.
It shouldn't be long before I reach Jackson.
Do you see any movement around you?
She asked.
Nothing. It's too dark.
Gordon said.
Wait. Jackson's GPS tracker is moving towards me.
He paused, checking the location.
Wait a minute. He's moving at more than 50 miles per hour. That's not...
He fell silent, and his feed cut off. Cameron sat back in shocked defeat. She couldn't even attempt to call out to her friends. She knew they were all gone. She simply stood up and walked towards the kitchen in the station. Without saying a single word, she picked up one of the knives and cut her own throat, her decision taking less than a split second. Since we saw it from her point of view, it was hard to tell what exactly happened, but the following stream of blood and subsequent gurgles hinted towards what she did. It felt like ages before the gurgling stopped. But no sooner had she gasped for her last breath of air, before a creature stood in the periphery of the camera. We couldn't see anything more than a blurry outline, far too tall and skinny to be human. Even though everything around it seemed sharp, the camera refused to focus on it, even as it moved closer. It bent down to inspect Cameron's lifeless body, still blurry, and for a moment it seemed to not understand her demise, like it couldn't quite grasp the concept of taking one's own life. It quickly realized that something was watching, as it placed its own face directly in front of the camera. Only a second passed before the feed cut once more, but this time, rather than staying black, it was replaced with a frozen image of whatever that creature was, and audio turned to a glass-shattering screech. The sound was louder than anything I had ever heard. Even clutching my ears barely did anything to stop its incessant screams. It was rhythmic, almost like Morse code, but faster and more erratic. It wasn't just coming from the television. In fact, each and every electronic device in the house connected to the internet played the same horror. The stereo from my neighbor's house, and from the radio of a car driving by. As far as I could tell, the whole world had turned into one horrific scream. I hadn't noticed until then that my father sat glued in front of the television screen, unblinking and unresponsive. I tried to pull him away, but to no avail. He was in some sort of trance. Be it from a broken circuit or from the screeching itself, suddenly everything in the house shut down, a total blackout affecting only our house. The screeching then stopped around the neighborhood, and once the television turned back on, the entire channel was gone. It's been a little over a month since the events of Bright Horizon 9, and there's not a shred of evidence of this ever happening. According to every available source, we haven't even visited Mars yet. My parents made me go see a therapist, and I almost convinced myself I'd gone crazy for a while. But here I am, desperately looking for someone else that remembers. I don't know why I haven't forgotten, but I can't be alone. These things, whatever they are, killed the entire crew without breaking a sweat, and managed to hijack the equipment on board Bright Horizon 9, erasing the collective memory of the entire human race. They needed us to forget, so that we can't prepare to fight back. I truly hope I am crazy, because if I'm not, they are coming here. Next. When I first laid eyes on the listing of this house, I knew it was the one for me. It wasn't too extravagant by any means, but for a bachelor that spends far too much of his time working, it was perfect. It was your average run-of-the-mill suburban house, nestled between two others at the center of a small cul-de-sac. The exterior was a muddled eggshell white color. A rather tall oak tree loomed in the back of the house. During my walkthrough of the house, I was becoming more and more attached to it with each room I inspected. The living room wasn't terribly spacious, but it was enough for a couch and a decent-sized television. The kitchen was actually slightly larger than the living room, which had been completely remodeled from the ground up. Down a narrow hallway led to the two bedrooms, as well as a bathroom tucked in between them. The master bedroom's larger size more than made up for the lack of a third bedroom, while the second bedroom, albeit much smaller than the master, was perfect for an office, which is precisely what I turned it into. You see, I'm a writer by profession, and I needed a house that had an extra room such as this. Near the kitchen was a door that led into the house's basement. The basement wasn't much to look at. It wasn't terribly large, and I thought it was more akin to a storage unit rather than a full-on basement. After examining the entirety of the house, I told the realtor that I wanted it. She gave out an audible sigh of relief as she jotted down some notes. Under her breath, she made a rather odd statement. "Hope it sticks," she said. I could tell she didn't mean to express that out loud when I inquired as to what she meant. She looked concerned, as if I was going to back out due to that remark. She mentioned that the house had been on the market very frequently over the past few years. She told me families would move in, live here for about a year, and then move out. Every time she would ask them, or her realty company, about it, they'd just say it wasn't a good fit. She hastily mentioned that she didn't mean anything negative by her remark, that she just wanted to see a good home go to a good person and for them to be happy for a long time. I reassured her that she hadn't dissuaded me in the slightest. It's been about a year and a half since I had moved into the house. I've gotta say, I still felt the same about it as I did on that first walkthrough all those months ago. Well, that was until a few days ago. I spend quite a lot of my time cooped up in my office typing away on my keyboard. I'm very particular when it comes to my work. I can't have any noise while I'm writing. I mean it. I need absolute silence so I can focus. I have some friends who can work or play video games while listening to music full blast, but not me. The first night while I was writing, I was jolted from my keyboard by a random noise. The noise sounded like a large door being closed somewhere in my house. This made me extremely nervous sitting there in my office, as I thought someone had broken in. I quickly stood from my chair and looked around for any type of weapon I could use. The only thing I had readily available was a small stool near my desk. I grabbed it and hoisted it up as I walked over to my door. I cracked the door open and peeked out into the dark, narrow hallway. I couldn't seem to hear anything, which might have put some people at ease, but only seemed to increase my heart rate. Someone could be creeping around inside my house, trying to be as quiet as possible, I thought. I cautiously wandered out into the hallway and rounded the corner to my living room area. I flicked the nearby light switch, and as the bulbs illuminated, I hollered a feeble war cry, ready to bash the would-be intruders with my stool. The living room was empty. I lowered the stool and went around my entire house, turning on all the lights while examining each room. My entire house was completely empty, though there wasn't any doubt in my mind regarding what I had heard. After taking a moment to think, my eyes landed upon my basement door. How original, I thought as I walked over to it. I gingerly opened the basement door, still a bit apprehensive. I quickly flipped the switch inside the doorway, bathing the basement with a dull yellow light. I called out to the seemingly empty basement. "The police are on their way! You better show yourself!" Silence only answered my bluff as I stared down the steps. I sighed as I lifted my stool once again and trekked down to the basement. As I rounded the stairs at the bottom, I could see the multitude of boxes and other bins I had brought down here for storage. I looked around for a few moments, shuffling and peeking around boxes. After finding no sign of anyone, my mind finally began to relax. I turned to walk back towards the stairs, and when I did, I felt the ground below me bend under my weight, and the creaking of wood whined slightly. I looked down and found myself standing upon a wooden trap door. I was stunned and confused. Even though it had been over a year, I still remember the walkthrough and bringing down multiple rounds of boxes to this basement very clearly. This trap door wasn't here before. Even though I felt a wave of anxiety building within me, I also felt a strange curiosity mounting as well. I leaned down and grabbed the worn metal latch. With a heavy clang, the door came free and I lifted it open. The glow from the light bulb overhead only barely extended below the hidden door's entrance. I could see a small wooden ladder of sorts, seemingly fixed to the wall inside. I walked over to a tool chest a friend had gifted me earlier in my life and found a flashlight inside. After wrapping the light on my hands a few times, the bulb ignited and a beam shot down into the abyss. I tried to angle the light and my gaze to see if I could spy anything interesting, but it was still too dark. I wanted to leave it be, but that ever-growing curiosity in my mind wouldn't let me just walk away. I climbed down the ladder, swearing to myself that I would just take a peek, then climb back up. I began to descend, and after climbing for a few seconds, my feet plunged into ankle-deep water. I groaned as I thought about all the disgusting things that could be residing here. I shined my light around me, and quickly realized that I was now standing in a tunnel of sorts. Although my flashlight was a decent model, it still wasn't strong enough to penetrate more than a few feet away. Satisfied with my investigation, I reached for the ladder. Panic killed the curiosity in my mind as my hand rested upon a solid brick wall. The wooden slats were nowhere to be found. I quickly aimed my flashlight upwards, and the hatch that was once above me was gone. I was on the verge of hyperventilating. I looked back and forth rapidly in both directions, trying to decide on what to do. Then I heard something. A light splash followed by the sound of dripping water echoed down the corridor. I felt my hands began to tremble as I tried in vain to steady the flashlight. A second splash sounded, then a third, followed by a fourth. The sounds were growing closer, though I still couldn't discern from which direction. Then, as I frantically waved my flashlight back and forth, the light reflected off something in the distance. Two orbs lit up in the encompassing darkness. I knew they were eyes, but something seemed off about them. They were perfectly round, like two shining marbles suspended in the air. I couldn't see what they were attached to, but I knew I didn't want to find out. They seemed to bob up and down with each splash, yet they never blinked. It was coming closer. I was about to make a run for it when I felt my shirt sleeve get caught on something next to me. I turned and saw that the wooden slats had come back. A grin appeared on my face as I grabbed onto the first slat. Then, I felt a gust of warm air brush the side of my face. Right next to me, in my peripheral vision, were those two round eyes I had seen. It had somehow closed that massive gap between us in only a few short seconds. I instinctively shut my eyes and started to climb, dropping my flashlight in the process. I thought for sure whatever it was would grab me, kill me, and eat me, but nothing happened. I scrambled out of the hatch and onto the basement floor. I slammed the hatch shut, ran upstairs, and closed the door behind me. After barricading the door, I sat in my room all night, too frightened to move. Hours passed, and I must have fallen asleep huddled next to the wall. The next morning, after the sun had come up, I mustered enough courage to investigate the basement once again. Only this time, when I reached the bottom of the steps, that trap door was nowhere to be found. I thought maybe I had gotten tired while writing that night, went to bed, and just had an intensely vivid nightmare. That was until I went back down into the basement one more time just to be sure. Sitting there, in the same exact spot as where the trapdoor had once resided, was the flashlight I had dropped in the commotion. It was still slick with the water from that tunnel. And right next to it, on the cold concrete floor, was the largest handprint I had ever seen. I have no idea how to explain any of this, but I think I'm starting to understand why this house wasn't a very good fit for all those previous residents. Everyone has that one thing in life that they absolutely love. For some, it might be their smartphone or computer. For others, it might be a certain food or perhaps a place. Those are all fine things to love. But if I had to choose something that I truly loved in life, it would probably have to be books. I know what you may be thinking. Books? Who would love books more than their phone or computer? Well, I grew up in a time before those luxuries existed. Computers were starting to become more and more integral to our society. But unless you had the means to acquire one, you just had to go without. Even still, computers back in those days weren't as streamlined as today. For most of my childhood, I didn't have very many friends. We lived in an area that didn't have very many children in it, so finding company was difficult. As a result of this, I ended up throwing myself into my school studies. I still hated school, but I did get pretty good grades. One year, my teacher asked us to go to the local library and select a book for a book report. Even though it was many years ago, I still remember how intimidating the building looked as I entered it. The exterior had large, ornate engravings into the stone walls. A statue of a lion stood stoically adjacent to the large wooden doors. The door opened with a slight hiss, as a gust of air bellowed out from within. The smell of wood and dusty paper filled my nose as I entered. Through the eyes of a child, this library appeared endless in design. Rows upon rows of books lined every wall, shelf, and some were even stacked upon desks. I was in awe of this place as I hadn't previously stepped foot in a library before. I was at a loss for words and I wasn't sure where to go. Then, an old man peered up from an old worn counter. He greeted me with a grin, some teeth absent in places. Patchy tufts of white hair clung to his balding scalp. He adjusted his large glasses upon his face as I approached. I told him I had been tasked with a book report and that I needed to choose a book. The old man looked me over for a bit, before giving me a slight nod. He led me to a bookshelf and his fingers gingerly tapped along the spines of multiple books. After a few moments, his hand came to rest upon one in particular, and he handed it to me. The cover had a large man standing behind a boy who was grabbing what appeared to be a wheel of a ship. In large, bold letters in the corner of the book, the words "Treasure Island" were written. I thanked him and was about to leave before he called me back. "You need a library card to check that out," he said. I frowned as I didn't have one, but he just grinned and walked back over to his counter. He retrieved a small paper card and told me to fill out my name. I obliged. With a single swift motion, he stamped the book and handed it to me. "Don't forget to return it when you're finished," he said. I nodded and left. Treasure Island was just the first of many books I've read during my lifetime. From fantasy to sci-fi, horror to mystery, I've enjoyed all the genres. Well, not so much the romance novels, but you get the idea. About halfway through the school year, my father had gotten a promotion at his job. Upon accepting, we had to relocate a few states away to accommodate his new position. I resented him for it, but slowly overcame it as seemingly every month he'd come home with a brand new book for me to read. After high school, I had gotten a job in a nearby city, and I myself had moved to be closer to my job. Even though I still loved to read, my life quickly got in the way of that. Where I once used to be able to read every single night, eventually it became every other week, then every other month. Before I knew it, I had stopped reading altogether. As the years went on, my performance at work ebbed and flowed. I was frequently tired. People got on my nerves often. To basically sum it up, I was unhappy. In all my years working at the same company, I hadn't once taken a sick day nor a vacation. I honestly had no desire to. Until a couple days ago, that is. I had forgotten to file a few reports during the week, and my boss was livid to say the least. After an hour of him shouting at me, I submitted to take an entire month of paid time off. I had the time, and I desperately needed a break. Since the way my job works, all time off requests go through upper management, not necessarily my boss, so it was approved by the end of the day. Upon leaving work that day, I felt a weight fall from my shoulders as I sauntered over to my car. It was the first time in a while since I had an abundance of free time. As I was driving home from work, my eye caught the glimpse of a strangely familiar stone building. I rubbed my eyes as best I could, trying to maintain a hand on the steering wheel. I looked closer and there it was. The same library from my youth. I was surprised, to say the least. This obviously wasn't the same building. It couldn't be. But maybe they used the same architect, I thought. Either way, I felt a childlike sense of wonder build as I pulled my car over. I walked up the steps, past the slightly worn lion statue, and entered through the wooden doors. That same familiar scent hit my nose and I felt a wave of peace pass through me. I began walking through aisles looking for a book I might like to read. Like I've said, I've read mostly every genre, so deciding on what to read next was always challenging. Before I could decide, a voice greeted from behind. "Ah, welcome back. Do you need assistance?" I turned and my jaw fell open slightly. Standing in front of me was that same old man from my childhood. Have you ever seen something so impossible that your brain simply can't process it? Well, that was happening to me. As if on autopilot, my response was limited. "I'm looking for a book?" I said.
"Here, try this one."
He spoke softly, handing me a black book with no title. I looked it over and asked more about it. The old man remained quiet for a few moments before saying,
"It's one you've read before, but still worth it."
My mind drifted back to Treasure Island, but this book looked completely different. I gave the old man a slight nod and began to leave when he stopped me once again.
"Do you have your library card?"
He asked aloud. At that moment, I knew this was no mere coincidence. I turned back and told the old man that I must have forgotten my card at home. He just returned a familiar grin, and with a snap of his fingers, a card appeared in his hand. He gently handed it to me and I looked it over. It was the same card I had as a kid. I was sure about it. By that point, I just wanted to get out of this episode of Twilight Zone and get home. I turned to leave and the old man said one more thing before I left.
"Try not to finish it too quickly."
And with that, I left. After arriving home, I tried my best not to think about what had happened, but as I set my bag on the counter, the small black book tumbled out and landed with a hollow thud. I picked it up and read the first page. It talked about a woman named Mary, who was about to have a child. I thought it was funny because Mary is my mother's name. I read for a bit and she finally had a baby boy. His name was Nathan. I stopped for a moment, wondering if the old man had played some kind of trick on me. Though, after reading for a bit, I quickly realized what this book was about. It was about my entire life. I was both horrified and morbidly curious at the same time. I couldn't seem to break my eyes from the pages. The old man was right. I had read it before, but not like this. Page after page contained thousands of memories. Learning to ride a bike, graduating school, my first kiss, my first job. Every event in my life had been cataloged in this book. Before I knew it, the sun had diminished and I found myself in my study hunched next to my desk lamp, rapidly scanning the pages. My childhood turned into my teen years, followed next by my adult life, and I was quickly approaching my current life. A thought began to worm its way into my mind. What comes after? Is it possible I could see into my own future just by reading it? Finally, I turned the page and found myself in the book, sitting there reading this book. I chuckled at the thought. And just as I did, I read the same exact reaction. I turned the page and read the words. There was a sudden knock on the door. Not a second after I had read that, I heard a loud knock sound on my front door. I stood up and went to answer it, but when I did, there was nobody there. I thought nothing much of it, so I returned to continue reading. The next line in the book sent an icy chill down my spine. Even though Nathan answered the door, it was too late. It had already entered. Then I heard the floor creak outside my door and I immediately shut the book. I'm not sure what is out there or what is going to happen next, but I can't stop thinking about how few pages there are left in the book. And I can't stop thinking about what the old man said, about finishing this book too quickly.